Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story that forces an impossible choice. What would you do if saving your child meant accepting the help of the very person trying to separate your family? Stay with me to see what happens next. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The happiness didn't disappear all at once. It faded slowly, like something too fragile to hold for long. For a few days, everything had felt almost normal. Not perfect, not easy, but peaceful. The baby was sleeping better, her breathing had become steadier, her small cries stronger, more certain, and each time she opened her eyes, even for a second, it felt like a quiet miracle. Tieu Lac had started smiling more, not the forced, careful smiles from before, but real ones, soft, gentle, the kind that come when the heart finally begins to believe that maybe things will be okay. The CEO watched her from across the room that morning. The sunlight filtered through the window, falling softly across her face as she leaned over the baby, whispering something only a mother would understand. He didn't interrupt, didn't move. Because moments like this, they didn't come often, and when they did, you learned to stay still, to let them exist, even if only for a while. The phone rang quietly, a sharp sound in a soft room. He glanced at it, an unknown number. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but something told him not to. He stepped outside, closed the door behind him, then answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "This is the pediatric cardiology department." His chest tightened instantly. "I'm calling regarding your daughter." The world seemed to narrow, just slightly, not enough to break, but enough to change everything. "We've reviewed her recent reports," the voice continued, "and there are some concerns we need to investigate further." Silence. The kind that stretches just long enough for your mind to start filling in the worst possibilities. What kind of concerns? His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. A brief pause. Then, because she was born prematurely, there is a higher risk of congenital heart conditions. Each word landed slowly, carefully, as if even the person saying them knew how much weight they carried. "We recommend a full diagnostic test to confirm her condition." The CEO closed his eyes for a second. Not long, just enough to hold himself together. "When?" "As soon as possible." Of course, there was never time, never a moment to prepare. "And the cost?" he asked quietly. Another pause, longer this time. "The full test is quite specialized." The number came next, clear, precise, and heavy. He didn't react immediately, didn't interrupt. He just listened. Then, understood. The call ended, and for a moment, he didn't move. The corridor felt different again, not like before, not tense, not suffocating, but hollow, like something had just been taken out of it, leaving only space and echo. He leaned back slightly against the wall, his hands still, his eyes distant. Because now, this wasn't about fear, it was about reality, cold, clear, unavoidable. He had just started over, just begun to rebuild something from nothing, and already something bigger had arrived. Not a problem he could solve with effort alone, not something he could fix with time, but something that demanded more than he had. Inside the room, Tieu Lac didn't know. Not yet. She was still sitting beside the baby, gently adjusting the blanket, humming softly under her breath. The baby moved slightly. A small sound. Alive, present, safe for now. Tieu Lac smiled faintly. "You're getting stronger every day," she whispered. And she believed it. Because sometimes, hope chooses what it wants to see. He stood outside the door, his hand on the handle, but he didn't open it. Not immediately. Because there are moments when stepping inside means carrying something with you, something heavy, something that changes everything. And for a brief second, he allowed himself to stand still, to breathe, to think. Because once he told her, nothing would be the same again. He opened the door, slowly, quietly. Tieu Lac looked up, her smile still there. Soft, warm. Who was it? A simple question, a normal question. The kind that usually doesn't matter, but this time, it did. He walked in, closed the door behind him, and for a moment, he couldn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. So he did what people do when the truth is too heavy. He delayed. Just the hospital. Her expression shifted slightly. Is everything okay? There it was. The question that never comes alone. He nodded, too quickly. Just a routine follow-up. Not a lie, not entirely. But not the truth either. She watched him, carefully, because she knew him now, not the man he used to be, but the man he had become. And she could feel it. The hesitation, the weight behind his words. You're not telling me something. Her voice was soft, not accusing, just certain. He looked at her, then at the baby, then back at her, and for a moment, everything inside him pulled in two directions. Tell her, or protect her, both choices carried a cost. Both choices felt wrong. She needs another test. The words came out finally, slow, measured. Tieu Lac's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. What kind of test? A pause, then, they want to check her heart. Silence, not immediate panic, not yet. Just stillness. Because the mind takes time to catch up to fear. Why? Her voice dropped slightly, not weak, but quieter. Because she was born early. He kept it simple, kept it controlled. They just want to be sure. Tieu Lac nodded slowly, trying to absorb it, trying to stay calm. And is it serious? The question came softly, carefully, as if saying it louder might make it worse. He hesitated, just for a second. Then, they don't know yet. That part was true. And sometimes, truth is the only thing you can hold on to, even when it doesn't comfort you. Tieu Lac looked down at the baby. Her hand moved gently across her chest, as if trying to feel something, as if trying to protect something invisible. She looks fine. Her voice trembled slightly. She's breathing. She's eating. A pause. Maybe it's nothing. Hope again, fragile, necessary. He didn't take it away. He couldn't. Maybe. But his voice didn't carry the same certainty, and she heard it. Of course she did. The room grew quiet, not peaceful, not heavy, just uncertain. Because now, there was something new between them. Not fear, not yet, but the possibility of it. Tieu Lac looked up again, her eyes searching his. When do we do the test? He didn't answer immediately, because that question carried another one beneath it. The cost, the reality, the part he hadn't said yet. As soon as possible. Her expression tightened slightly. Then we should do it. Simple, direct, like everything else she believed in. But he didn't move, didn't respond. And that was when she understood. Not fully, but enough. It's expensive, isn't it? Her voice softened. Not surprised, not shocked, just aware. He looked away for a second, then back. Yes. The words stayed in the air, heavy, real. Tieu Lac nodded slowly. She didn't ask how much. She didn't need to. Because she knew, if he hesitated, it wasn't small. Her eyes dropped to the baby again, her hand still resting gently against her, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Because now, it wasn't just about fear. It was about choice. Again, always choice. The CEO stepped closer, sat beside her, his voice lower now. I'll take care of it. A pause. You don't need to worry. But this time, she didn't nod, didn't accept it so easily, because this time, she knew what that meant. You don't have anything left. The words were quiet, but direct, not accusing. Just true. He didn't answer, because there was no answer that could change that. The baby made a small sound, and both of them looked down instantly, still here, still breathing, still fighting, and that made everything else feel both smaller and heavier at the same time. Tieu Lac took a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll figure it out. The same words he had said before, but now they carried a different weight. Because this time, it wasn't about starting over, it was about survival. The CEO looked at her, then at the baby, then back at her, and something inside him shifted again. Not fear, not doubt, but determination. Because no matter what it took, he would not let this be the moment they broke. But outside, far from that quiet room, the world was already moving, already deciding, already waiting. Because when need meets limitation, something always gives. The only question was, what would it be? That night, the room didn't feel the same anymore. Nothing had changed on the surface. The baby still slept in soft, uneven breaths. The lights were still dim. The machine still hummed quietly. But inside, everything had shifted. The silence between them was no longer gentle. It was heavy. Not because of fear alone, but because of what came with it: responsibility, choice, and the cost of both. Tieu Lac lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She wasn't crying, she wasn't panicking, she was thinking. And that was somehow more dangerous, because thoughts don't stay still. They grow, they connect, they lead to places you didn't want to go. Beside her, the baby stirred slightly. A soft sound, alive, still here. Tieu Lac turned her head, her fingers moving instinctively, gently touching the baby's chest. You're going to be okay, she whispered. But her voice didn't carry the same certainty as before, because now she knew something she couldn't unknow. There was a problem, and it needed to be solved, not hoped away. Across the room, the CEO stood by the window. He hadn't sat down for a long time, hadn't rested, hadn't closed his eyes, because his mind wouldn't let him. Numbers, options, possibilities, every path he could think of ended the same way. Not enough, not fast enough. He pressed his fingers lightly against the glass, cold, real, and grounding, because right now, he needed something real, something that didn't move, something that didn't change, unlike everything else. He picked up his phone, scrolled, stopped. There were names, contacts, people from his past life, people who once answered his calls immediately, people who once needed him, relied on him, followed him. Now, they were just names, on a screen. He hesitated. Then, he called. The line rang, once, twice, 3 times, then connected. Hello? The voice sounded familiar, but distant. I need a favor. No introduction, no explanation, because there was no time. A pause. Then, what kind of favor? He didn't soften it, didn't disguise it. I need money. Silence, not shocked, not confused, just careful. That's unexpected. A small breath. Things have changed. Another pause, longer this time. I see. The voice shifted slightly, not colder, but not warm either. How much? He gave the number, clear, direct. The silence that followed was different, heavier. Because now, it wasn't about willingness, it was about reality. That's not a small amount. I know. Another pause. I can't do that right now. The words came carefully, not harsh, not dismissive, but final. I understand. And he meant it. He ended the call, then stood still. Again. Because rejection doesn't always come as a shock. Sometimes it comes exactly as expected. He made another call, then another. Different people, different voices, different answers, but the same result. Not now, not possible, too complicated, too much. One by one, the doors closed. Quietly, without drama, without conflict, just absence. And that was worse, because it meant there was no one left to turn to. Inside the room, Tieu Lac sat up slowly. She had heard enough. Not everything, but enough. The tone, the pauses, the silence after each call. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask, because she knew. And sometimes, knowing is heavier than hearing. The CEO lowered his phone. His hand stayed there for a moment, as if holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. Then he made one last call. His fingers moved slower this time, more deliberate, because this call was different. The line connected almost immediately. "Madam has been expecting your call." The voice on the other end was formal, controlled. He didn't speak right away, because now he understood. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't bad luck. This was pressure, calculated, placed, and waiting. "I need to speak to her." A pause. Then, one moment. The line shifted, silence again, but this time not empty, anticipating. Then, her voice, calm, unchanged. "You took longer than I thought." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "What do you want?" Straight, no hesitation, because there was no point in pretending. "You already know." Her answer came immediately. "The offer still stands." A pause. "Bring the child to the city." Another pause. "And everything will be taken care of." The words settled in the air, cold, clear, unavoidable. He looked across the room, at Tieu Lac, at the baby, and for a moment, everything inside him pulled in opposite directions again. Tieu Lac met his eyes. She didn't hear the conversation, but she didn't need to, because she knew who it was. And she knew what it meant. Her fingers tightened slightly around the blanket, not in fear, but in decision. "You're asking me to choose." His voice dropped, not angry, but firm. "No." Her reply came softly. "I'm asking you to act responsibly." A pause. "For your child." Silence, because that argument was hard to fight, not because it was right, but because it sounded like it could be. He didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, the line wasn't just emotional, it was practical. The baby needed the test, needed the care, needed something he couldn't provide, not yet. "Think carefully." Her voice softened slightly, but not for too long. The call ended, just like that. No pressure, no demand, just time. Limited. The room fell quiet again, but this time, it wasn't just heavy. It was decisive, because now, the question wasn't hidden anymore. It was clear, sharp, unavoidable. The CEO lowered his phone slowly, then walked back toward the bed, each step measured, controlled, because this moment would define everything. Tieu Lac watched him, didn't look away, didn't speak, because whatever came next, they would face it together, or not at all. He stopped beside her, looked down at the baby, then at her, and finally, spoke. "There's a way." A pause. "But it comes with a condition." Tieu Lac's heart tightened. She already knew, but she still asked. "What condition?" He didn't look away this time, taking her to the city. Silence, long, heavy, because this wasn't just a decision, it was a line, a risk, a possibility of losing something they couldn't replace. The baby made a small sound, and both of them looked down. Still here, still fighting, still waiting. For them. Tieu Lac took a slow breath, her voice steady, but soft. If that's what she needs. A pause. Then we go. The words came out, but they didn't feel complete because something was missing. Something unspoken. The CEO's chest tightened. And you? A simple question, but it held everything. She looked at him, and for a moment, her eyes softened, just slightly. I'll be wherever she needs me to be. A pause. Even if it's not where I belong. There it was. The same thought, the same fear, still alive, still present. He shook his head immediately. No. This time, there was no hesitation. No more choosing between you and her. A pause. We go together. Silence, and in that silence, something settled. Not certainty, not safety, but unity. Outside, somewhere far away, a plan was already unfolding, waiting, watching. Because decisions like this never come without consequences. Inside the room, two people sat beside a fragile life, holding on to something bigger than fear, but smaller than certainty, and the question remained. When the path forward is the same path that could pull you apart, will love still be enough to keep you together? The CEO receives devastating news that his newborn daughter may have a congenital heart condition due to premature birth and urgently needs an expensive test. With no money left after being cut off by his mother, he struggles to find a solution, reaching out to old connections but facing rejection at every turn. Meanwhile, Tieu Lac senses the burden he is carrying and learns the truth about their child's condition. As pressure builds, the CEO's mother offers help, but with a condition: take the baby to the city and separate from Tieu Lac. Torn between saving his child and protecting his family, the CEO faces an impossible decision. In the end, he refuses to choose between them and decides they will face everything together, even if it means stepping back into a world that once tried to tear them apart.